Hello, everyone, and welcome to a quick video here on our introduction to Excel. Each week, I'll produce probably a couple of these videos demonstrating some examples from in Excel that relate to what we're talking about in the textbook or going through an example, etc. And so we're starting at day one, week one, chapter one. And so, as I mentioned in some of my other videos, we start out in the textbook at basically ground zero, assuming you know nothing and then working from there. And so some of the stuff in these early chapters, you will have some connection to, even if you don't have never used Microsoft Excel before. In other cases, you're going to learn little tips or tricks, different ways of doing things that you may not have known about that even existed in Excel. And based on past experience teaching this course over 20 years, most people have some experience exposure. They've used Excel or Google Sheets for something at some point in their life coming into this class, but that experience varies. Some of you have had internships, some of you may be working adults. But generally, by the time we get through the first four chapters, that exhausts what people have already had some previous exposure to, and everything is new. And even in chapters one through four, as I said, there's things that we talk about that you may have done one way, but not realize there's a more efficient or a better way. There's lots of tips and tricks. One of the things about Excel is it's built around the idea of making people more efficient. And I won't go into the history of Excel right now, but it was created by a man in the late 1970s, or two men, who were business students at Harvard, and they created a program called VisiCalc, the very first electronic spreadsheet that eventually became, adopted by a lot of different businesses, and eventually Microsoft and Bill Gates, took up a version of it, and VisiCalc got bought out by a competitor who eventually lost out to Microsoft Excel, and so. But the idea of creating the program was computers can do the work, the calculations, that's what they're good at. And if we can remove people from doing the manual calculations, using pencil and paper, using a calculator, etc., well, then we can, free up those resources so that those people can do things that are more value added, that are going to help think strategically about the business, do business planning, carry out productive activities. And so the idea is we want to let Excel do what it's good at, and then that's going to give us more time to do other things. And so we'll talk perhaps more about that history of Excel later on. There's a couple of videos out there on the web that are sort of interesting that I might make available. But for right now, when I type or when I click in a cell, so I've got Microsoft Excel open. You're probably familiar with the format of a spreadsheet. You've got numbered columns going across from left to right, A through Z. When you get to Z, it then starts at A and B, etc. And we have row numbers starting at one, and they go down and down and down. And in the current version of Excel, you can store a lot of data. In this class, we're not necessarily going to be focused on, using huge data files, but there are times in MIS 260 where we've done work with data files that have 400,000 rows of data. And it sounds like a really big number, and it is a lot of data, but it's not really a big deal to Excel, and it's not a big deal to us if we were to use one of those files, because when we're using Excel, again, if we have 40 rows of data or we have 400,000 rows of data, typically the work for us is exactly the same. you know, we have to maybe drag a highlight a little bit longer. We have to add another zero or two on to the equation, but the work is done by the computer. And so when you have 400,000 rows of data, your computer does have to work a little harder. The wheel spins just a little bit longer than it might when you have a small data set. But by and large, for us, it's not a big deal. And so in the intersection of a row and column, right now my cursor is in cell B2. I can enter in three different kinds of information. I can type in text. And so in this case, I'm going to type Excel demo number one, and we're going to create here a hypothetical student budget. And Certainly, I can type in text. If I type that text in and it's wider than the column width, it's going to spill over into cell C2, D2, E2. In theory, I could type a sentence, I could type a paragraph, I could type a 20-page religion paper. It wouldn't work very well, and formatting would get really difficult. That's why word processing exists, so that I can write written documents. But it is necessary to have text in a spreadsheet because if I have a lot of numbers, I still need labels to understand what does the data represent. Or if I'm going to present the results, I need labels to understand what are these calculated values. I may need a little bit of text in the form of phrases or sentences to explain what the results mean. And so text is certainly one piece. And when you have text, you can do a lot of things in formatting. In chapter two, the textbook spends a lot of time talking about formatting. You'll notice on the home ribbon, there are some familiar icons if you're a Microsoft user where I have choices of fonts, I have font sizes, I have background colors, font colors, I can make things bold, italics, underline, etc. Those are all the exact same icons that you have in Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. And so there's some familiarity there, even if you've never used Excel, but you've used other Microsoft products. And if you've used Google Sheets or Google Docs, again, they are very close cousins, but not exactly the same. I should mention, just to say it, that for this class, if you uh, are traditionally using Google Sheets, you will need to use Excel, especially in the SAM projects. You have to upload an Excel file. It has to be an XLSX file format. And so if you don't have the current version of Microsoft Office, it is available to Augsburg students for free. There is a link in Moodle for you to download that. You can download it. I believe you get a 4-year license for it. And so even if you are going to graduate in a year or two or three, it is free for that 4-year period. With the license that you get, I believe you can install it on up to 5 different machines. And so if you have a laptop and a tablet and a home computer, you could, install it on all of those. And so it is a benefit of being a student. Microsoft wants you to learn it. They want you to, adopt it, and they provide it free for educational purposes. And so that is something that I would highly encourage you to take advantage of, especially because if you happen to have an old version of Excel, say you're running Excel 2019 or maybe even Excel 2016, they might look similar, but they're not exact. And every version has its own bells and whistles and things that are added. And so, if you're using an older version of Excel, you might have that issue that, my screen doesn't look exactly like the one in the textbook. And so, using the most current version is quite helpful. The other thing that I should mention is that, certainly some of you have PC computers, some of you have Macs. You can download and install Microsoft Office for free for either one of them. Excel for Mac is very similar to the PC version. It's not 100% exact. Over the years, that gap has certainly shrunk, but there's probably 98, 99% of things are exactly the same on the Mac version as they are on the PC. There's just a few things that happen, and you'll see notes in the textbook or a SAM project if there's a difference. Oftentimes it relates to differences in function keys or things like that. But if you have a Mac, you can certainly get through the course and do the work on it. But if you want to be, perfectly synced with the textbook and the homework and all the activities, the PC version is, built for that purpose. And so that's just a reality of technology. And as I also mentioned, if you're using SAM, the online parts of it, it does prefer Chrome or Firefox. And so if you're using Safari, a lot of times it will work, but there are times, and unfortunately, it sometimes happens when we're taking a quiz or an exam where the system locks up or it, freezes. That tends to happen a whole lot more on Safari than it does the other browsers. And so, and anytime if you were, to email me and say I'm having trouble, my browser getting into SAM is having this trouble. One of my first questions is, well, which browser are you using? And again, it's not 100% fixed for every single issue, but I would say 90% of the time, if you were using Safari, switching to the browser, that issue goes away. And so it's just a reality that for programmers, developing software and websites and so forth, many browsers do the same function, but there are some minor differences, and Cengage is going to create and program for those that have the highest usage. And so it turns out Google Chrome is the most widely used browser on the planet. It's also Firefox is up there. Safari is popular, but not as popular in that list. And so if you have to choose compatibility, their compatibility matching with Chrome. And so we've got text. If I need to adjust the width of a column, I can adjust it by dragging. I put my cursor up on the intersection between the columns, and I can drag left and right. I can also right click and choose column width, and it will let me enter in a number. So sometimes in a SAM assignment, they'll say, well, make the column width 12 and a half characters. And so if I do that, it will adjust. And if I want to auto fit, if you're asked to auto fit, double clicking on that intersection will automatically widen the column to fit the biggest item in that column. And again, sometimes that's what you're asked to do. Sometimes that's what we want to do. That's not always the answer. And so, again, you want to be careful to follow the directions. But we do want to pay attention to formatting, because the purpose of Excel isn't necessarily just to calculate the right number or do the math. Excel can certainly be a calculation tool, but it's also a communication tool. It's a way for me to take a bunch of data, do the calculations, and present that information, whether it's in a physical presentation in front of people, whether it's an email, whether it's a PowerPoint presentation. And so formatting is just as important in Excel, and laying it out and colors and styles and all of that as the calculations. We're going to not spend as much time on the colors and formatting and so forth. Chapter two will get into a little bit of that, and there's certainly elements. But when you work for a company that has a particular brand color combination, and they're very public, they may have very strict guidelines about this is the way that every document that's put out by Target or Best Buy or so forth is formatted. You have to use these colors, you have to use these styles. Again, it's a way in marketing to have a consistent brand image. And so, when you may not think of these things as, documents or ads that we put out in, to the consumer. But if I'm dealing with suppliers, I want my suppliers to know that, this is Best Buy or this is Target. And so that, everything that comes from that company looks similar and is identifiable and so forth. And so you can go a long ways in Excel doing that kind of stuff. The other thing can do is I can type in numbers. Again, there will be lots of numerical data in our spreadsheets, and I can type in formulas or functions. And we'll talk about the difference between formulas and functions here in a second. For this example, I'm going to make a hypothetical student budget, and we're going to do it for the first 6 months of the year. And so I'm going to go in, and the first month of the year is January, so I can type in the word January. The next month is February, and so I can type in February. And I'm guessing all of you know the months of the year. You also all know how to type, no matter, whether that's fast or slow. But in Excel, there is something called autofill, and it has a number of different flavors. And again, it's meant at efficiency. And so if I type the first 2 months of the year, January, February, I highlight them with the mouse, and then I put my cursor in the lower right corner like I have here. The cursor turns into a black plus sign. I'm going to hold my left mouse button down and drag to the right. And when I do that, Excel is going to automatically extend that series, and it's going to put in March, April, May, June. And if I drag to the right, it would continue July, August, September. When I got to December, it would roll around to August, no, not August, roll around to January and continue the cycle. And so if I wanted to make a 5-year budget, I could just keep dragging, and I would, after 60 months, I'd have 5 years worth of name titles on those columns. I'm going to just click down here for a second. It also works with numbers. So if I type 1, 2, I highlight and want to fill to continue that series, it would, put 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I put in 10, 20, do that, and then use the fill handle, it will then, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. And so it sees a pattern and it continues that pattern. And so it works with a lot of things. It can be numbers, it can be months, it can be days of the week. And so anytime you're wanting to have a list of numbers from 1 to 100, you don't have to sit there and type every single number from 1 to 100 and worry about, did I type the same number twice? Did I miss a number, etc. These are, again, small, but in the macro time, they add up to efficiency. And in this case, I'm going to put my uh, and I'm going to do something here because I'm going to click on column B and highlight that entire column. I want to give myself a little more real estate to work with here. And so I'm going to click in column B, right click on the letter B in that gray area, and I'm going to say insert. And that will insert a new blank row, blank column. And so, anytime I build my spreadsheet, I can always add a new column. I can do the same thing and insert a new row. And so, we're not necessarily confined to this is the way I wrote it down on the piece of paper, and now it's stuck that way forever. I can insert, I can delete rows and columns. And I'm going to put in in a budget, we have money coming in and money going out. And I'm going to create for this hypothetical student budget a student that has two jobs. And the reason I have them having two jobs is I need two numbers because I want to do some math. And we might say, well, okay, how much money do they make from job number one every month? Let's say $1,000. And how much do they make from job number two? I'm going to make nice round $200. And when we make a spreadsheet, and especially with a budget or financial forecast, sometimes we have to make assumptions. I might say, well, I plan to make $1,000 a month every month, of this 6 month time period. I could type in 1,000 again and again and again and again. But if I click on that cell that contains the value 1,000 and drag the fill handle, I can drag and copy that value across all six columns of the spreadsheet. And I can do the same for my 200. I might have reasons to say, well, I know that in I don't know, pick a month. Say in May after finals, I'm going to go on vacation for a couple of weeks. I'm not going to be able to work, and so I'm only going to earn $500 during that month. I can make that change. That's always, part of the human element of updating and essentially doing what we call what if analysis. One of the goals of Dan Bricklin, who invented the idea of a spreadsheet, was we could build a spreadsheet, we can let it take over the calculations, and then that leaves time for the manager to say, well, what if this were to happen? What if that were to happen? And so I can go in here and say, well, what if I got a raise for, $1,200 in this month? Or what if I, took the month off, or I, quit my job? You could ask all of those, what if questions. The biggest piece of Excel is the ability to do calculations. And at its very heart, Excel is a visible calculator. The name VisiCalc came from that, idea. And we can look at the spreadsheet and we can say 1,000 plus 200. We know that in January, this student would get $1,200 of revenue. I don't want to type 1,200 in there and simply copy it across because, it wouldn't be correct for me. And if I were to ever come back and say, well, what if I worked an extra shift in February and earned an extra $100? Or what if my, job number two went silent in April and I didn't have it for the rest of the semester? We want to be able to have Excel automatically calculate without having to remember, oh, I made this change in the revenue and I now got to go and update any calculation that's based on it. Because in a spreadsheet, oftentimes one calculation impacts another, which impacts another, which impacts another. By the time we're done with this relatively short video, we're going to have a spreadsheet where you change one number and 18, 20 other values are going to change all at once. And so, that is something where I don't want to have to remember in my head months later which cells change or should change and I need to update. We want to set it up so that it will automatically update. And so to do that, I want to create a mathematical formula in cell C7 that's going to add those two values together. And it's pretty easy. One thing to remember, and it'll get ingrained in your brain pretty quickly, is every Excel formula or function starts with the equal sign. That tells Excel, I'm not typing something just to display it. I want you to do something, a calculation typically, and I'm going to put cell references. So I'm going to click C5 plus C6. And when I do that and I hit enter, it will take and do the math literally and tell me the answer is 1200. And so if I want to edit that, I can always double click on that cell. I can also go up here in the formula bar and either view it and or edit it. But it is building a mathematical equation that says, add these two cells together. And I can do subtraction, multiplication, division. I can use parentheses. I can use exponents. Excel uses the standard order of operations in algebra. So one thing you might have to dust off if it's not at the front of your mind is PEMDAS, you know, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction from left to right. The idea of which math do I do first when I have multiple pieces of math being done in the same equation. And so Excel always follows the rules of math. You have to tell it to do the math in the right way. And so in this case, there is no secondary calculation, so I don't have to worry about it. But in some of the calculations, there are going to be, and so I'm going to have to remember put parentheses where there should be, or don't put parentheses where I don't want them, et cetera, because it could have an effect on the calculated value. And so in this case, if I hit enter, it shows me the right answer. If I change a value, if I say, well, January's half over, I'm only going to make $600 in January. When I change that value, it will automatically update the value in C7. And so it's always, referencing those values and displaying the current result. And if I were to take this cell, which contains that C5 plus C6, and I use the fill handle and copy it to the right, it will actually adjust. It doesn't copy the value. It actually takes those cell references. And in this particular case, these are what are called relative references, meaning when I shift to the right, the references also shift. Because in addition to being C5 plus C6, the other way to think about those cells is take the value two cells above me and add the value one cell above me. And when I move to the right, it says, okay, I move to column D, take the value two cells above me, the value one cell above me, add them together, and the answer is 1200. And if I copy this formula all the way to the right, it will do that fill. And in every month, it is adjusting the value it displays based on the value two cells above that are being added together. And so relative references seem like magic. They certainly make you more efficient. I don't have to sit there and, type the variations of the same equation over and over and over again. But there are times where I don't want it to do that. And so we will eventually get to that here in this video. And that's probably one of the trickiest things in the first three chapters is when do I want relative references? When do I use absolute references? What are the differences between the two? In a SAM project, it's oftentimes easier because they will, allude to it or tell you in the instructions, create an absolute reference to this, create a relative reference to that. In the real world, when you're doing a project for your boss at an internship, they're not going to tell you that. You have to know, and based on what the spreadsheet is doing and how you're designing it, what that layout should look like. So we'll have some activities that'll be more like that kind of thing where here's a task your boss might give you, figure out how and when to use the right kind of references. In our spreadsheet, I'm also going to put some expenses, and I might have food, housing, and entertainment. I'm going to have three expenses in my budget because I want to have more than two. In the real world, again, you might have lots of expenses. That's typically the reality. I got a lot more expense categories than I do jobs coming in, with money coming in. But for brevity, I'm going to only have three. I'm going to make up some hypothetical numbers. Again, we oftentimes in class will talk about these numbers, and there's oftentimes a lot of debate about, well, what should that number, be? I'm going to say 100, 500. We'll put 50. And again, these numbers might be assumptions, and it's like this is what I'm allocating or thinking I'm going to spend. I might assume that these values are going to stay the same over the whole time period, so I could fill in those values, and I could grab all three, highlight all three in January, and drag to the right, and those values would be filled in. And if I wanted to add these up, I picked nice round numbers. I hope you can do this math in your head or very quickly with a calculator. But if you look at that, that's $650 is our total expenses. And again, I don't want to write 650 because I might decide, well, maybe in January I'm going to a concert and I bought a $50 ticket, so my entertainment costs are going to go up. Or maybe I am celebrating a special occasion in February, so I'm going to spend an extra $50 in dinner or whatever it might be. Again, we don't spend the same amount of money each time. We don't have the same numbers in every cell, but we can set up a structure with the calculation so that it automatically correctly calculates the total at the bottom. And I could go in here and I could say equals C10 plus C11 plus C12. And that is certainly fine with three values. If I said, well, I've got 10 expenses, add up C10 plus C11 plus C12 plus C13 plus C14 and on and on. That gets really lengthy. And so in Excel, rather than use a mathematical equation or a formula, there are functions. And the function that many people already know or heard of coming into the class, my mouse is acting up here, is the sum function. And so I could say equals sum, and functions are pre-named functions that are programmed to do a particular task. And the sum function adds up all the numbers in a range of cells. And so if I say equals sum, open parentheses, the syntax of the sum function is simply give me a range of cells. And when I say range of cells, I use my mouse and I highlight C10 through C12. That's actually going to be translated to C10 colon C12. What's the first cell? What's the last cell? And in practice, Excel will add up all the numbers in between. And so I'm going to close my parentheses, hit enter, and it will correctly calculate $650. If I had 400,000 rows of data, I could say C10 through colon C 400,010. Again, I'd have to know, the cells, or I'd have to highlight a lot of data, but it wouldn't make the work, it's not any more difficult to add up 400,000 rows of numbers. I just need to expand the range of the syntax in the function. And so we're going to learn a bunch of functions in this course. There's probably 200 functions in Excel. We probably learned 30 to 40, and that's okay. That's plenty more than we have time for. But the idea in Excel is that these functions have some families or categories. You don't need to know every function. I don't know every function by heart, but there are specific functions in Excel that if you're an accountant, there's 20, 30, 40 functions that you might use that somebody else who's not an accountant would never use in their life, or a finance professional, or an engineer, or a statistician, or so forth. And so there's a lot of specialized functions in Excel that certainly are useful and helpful, but they're not necessarily what we need to know as a general business student right now. Perhaps when you go on to finance or you go on to accounting, if that's your major, you'll get into even more of these functions. But the sum function certainly is a very basic task. And so if I take this cell and I take that fill handle and I drag to the right, it will adjust. It shows 650. Again, if I look under the hood, it is adding up D10 through D12. It is showing the sum of the three cells directly above. It's using what's called a relative reference. And if I then, drag this all the way across, all the values were the same, so the sum should be all the same, but the underlying cell function adjusts to add up the expenses of June in the June column. And the last thing I'll do here on this sheet is put in, profit loss. Not necessarily a term we always use personally, but certainly in a business sense. We would take our total money in, cell C7, subtract our total outgoing money as expenses, hit enter, and we would have a profit of $150 in that first month. And again, these are relative references, meaning that if I copy this to the right, it's going to keep those same referential positions, and the calculation of profit for each of those months is going to be done correctly. And so We can do some math with addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Again, in chapter one, they keep things relatively simple and straightforward. We can use some mathematical functions, or I should say, mathematical formulas to do whatever algebraic math we might want to do. We learn the sum function. We'll learn, a couple other functions in chapter three, which is where the, kind of the rise starts in the functions that we're going to cover. One thing related to chapter two is I might say, well, all these numbers are actually dollars. Why don't I make it look like dollars? So I'm going to highlight all of the cells and I'm going to go up to the home ribbon and there's a button that has a dollar sign on it. And if I click on that, it's going to apply what's called the accounting format. And it's going to put dollar signs, it's going to put decimal places and show .00 for cents. If I don't want the .00, I could decrease the decimal on the home ribbon and show it as whole dollars. A preview for chapter two is that if I right click and I say format cells, I get a window that gives me all of the possible choices of formatting categories. And then you have choices on how you align things, what fonts, the borders, the fills. There's a whole set. And so chapter two will spend a lot more time on formatting. And the last thing I want to show in this example is, well, what if I forgot something? And so I could say, well, I have another expense I want to add. I'm going to go down to row 12, right click on the number 12 and say insert to have it insert a blank row. I'm going to put in something that most students wouldn't put by themselves or put it as number four on their expense items. But I'm going to put retirement savings. And I picked this one for a couple of reasons. One is if I save for retirement, I could think about it two different ways. I could say, I'm going to put X number of dollars away each month for retirement. In the same way, I put $100 aside for food, or I put $500 aside for rent. And so I could do it as a dollar amount. When you graduate and get a job, most often your retirement plan that your company will offer a 401k plan where you will be asked to set aside a percentage of your income. And the idea of a percentage is that as your income goes up, you will then save more and over time, you'll be able to put aside more money for retirement. And so that's what I'm going to use in this example for that purpose and another. And so I'm going to put my retirement savings percentage label up in cell G1. And in cell I1, I'm going to put 0.05%. And 0.05% is 5% in decimal form. I could use formatting here on the home ribbon and click the percentage styles to say, well, maybe let's make that clear so people don't mistake that for a nickel. I'll put 5%. And what I want to do in cell C12 is calculate my retirement savings as 5% of my total revenue for the month. And so I can do that. I say equals, I want to do a calculation. I want to take my total revenue, which is in cell C7. I want to multiply, which is shift 8, the asterisk sign, and I want to multiply it times I1. And when I do that, 5% of $80 is $40. And Excel, when I inserted that column, it automatically adjusted the function down here to include that new row. So it automatically updated. I didn't have to edit that. And when that $40 became part of my expenses, it also then impacted my profit or loss, which went down by the $40. But now if I try to copy that calculation, C7 times I1 to the right, I'm going to get 0. And in Excel, I don't want to blindly trust that it just tells me the right answer. There are a couple things that are true in Excel. One is Excel never makes a math mistake. And two is Excel always does what you tell it to do. And so if I get a value that looks weird or doesn't look right, it's not that Excel is weirding out or having hallucinations. It's that I probably told it to do something incorrect. And I might say, well, I'm making more money in February, and yet it's telling me to save less. It's telling me to save nothing. And if I look at the underlying function when or I should say formula, when I copy to the right, it's taking D7, that's what I want, times J1. And what's happening is when I copy to the right, those relative references are doing what they're supposed to in Excel. I becomes J. But in this case, I don't want I to become J. I don't want to put 5% in J1 and 5% in K1 and so forth. And so I need a different kind of reference called an absolute reference that I put into this calculation, which is to say that if I put an anchor on that, or what's called an absolute reference. And in Excel, the symbol or the syntax for an absolute reference is to use dollar signs. And so if I multiply times dollar sign I, dollar sign one, the dollar sign locks the column and the row. Meaning when I copy it left to right, when I copy it down, if I were to do that, it would not change either of those references. And so now if I put those absolute reference symbols in, when I copy to the right, it will correctly calculate that 5% of $1,200 is 60. And the next month and the next month are 60. And then in May, when my income drops, my contribution drops to 35. And so relative and absolute references have to be designed and used. And as I said, that's probably one of the trickier things in the first three chapters. It's not, do I put dollar signs or not? The actual practice of putting them in is not difficult, but it's knowing when do I use them, when do I not, and getting more comfortable with that. And we'll have lots of practice with it. Again, Sam in the early stages will tell you put in a function with absolute reference or so forth. And over time they'll back away from that a bit in terms of direct instruction. And we'll have some activities for practice specifically about this because again, if I put in the wrong reference, I copy to the right, I don't realize that it's wrong. I might calculate a whole bunch of wrong numbers really quickly. So I said Excel is efficient. It can efficiently calculate the right answers, but it can also very efficiently calculate the wrong thing if you tell it to do the wrong thing. And if, again, if you're not stopping and thinking about does it make sense? Does that answer check out? You could do a lot of work very quickly and get a lot of wrong answers. And so getting a bunch of numbers on the spreadsheet isn't the goal, it's getting the right numbers. And again, a reminder in the SAM homeworks, they oftentimes show you a picture so that you could look at this file and see what does it look like at the end, or what should it look like, and do I have the right numbers? That's an aid for the homework. That doesn't help you in the real world, though. When your boss gives you a task and you have to go create a spreadsheet, they're not going to give you an answer and say, well, I know what the answer is. This is what it should look like. They're going to expect you to do it and do it correctly. And so that finishes our first example. We'll come back in a second video next week for chapter 2. We'll look at this spreadsheet to start in terms of, and talk about it in terms of a little more formatting. And then we will get into some other examples. And in the first 3 chapters, I like to do a number of examples that vary the content between the first 3 chapters because by themselves each individual chapter is less exciting and less focused on a particular task. You wouldn't want to see an entire demo just on formatting. We did a little bit of formatting here. We'll see some more formatting in the next one. And we'll also start to sprinkle in some of the stuff from chapter 3 that we're going to start to pick up and think about, well, how can I write these functions that are built to do specific tasks that are both mathematical, but then we're going to get into some logical functions where we can start to have Excel think for itself. And again, it might sound scary, but it's not too difficult. We just have to learn how to speak to Excel and tell it what we want it to do and how we want it to think. And so in that way, we'll wrap up for today, and I will talk to you soon.